Alright guys, thank you so much for getting this follow-up video. In this video, we will talk about two main things. We will talk about crucial river strategy after betting small on the flop and on the turn, and we will also talk about one very important turn exploit. Of course, this video is a direct follow-up to the free video that's on the YouTube channel, so definitely make sure you watch that full thing before going to this one. As always, I want to keep these very practical and straight to the point, so let's get right into it. I think a lot of people are very unsure of how to play on the river after betting small on the turn, and so having a clear strategy here is actually going to give you a lot more confidence and help you implement that small turn bet. And of course, as we know, that small turn bet is going to be very good for bluffing. On the river, we want to carefully consider the specific range versus range interaction and then select our strategy. Just like in the YouTube video, we're going to look at a few boards as our case studies and then see how the solver plays there in order to form that very rough baseline for what to do. In particular, we're going to identify how big different hand classes prefer to bet, because that will be key for figuring out our overall strategy. After you understand that baseline, the only real point to keep in mind is that you should play very exploitatively on the river and overbluff. We can gain a lot of EV by bluffing on the river, and pretty much every bet size is going to generate an overfold. As I mentioned before, one key reason why this line works out so well exploitatively is because our opponents have a very low defending threshold when we bet small on the flop and when we bet small on the turn, right? So if we're betting small here, our opponents have to defend with a whole bunch of weak hands. But even if our opponents are folding too much here, for instance, maybe they're not calling often enough with their pocket sevens or pocket sixes, etc., realistically, our opponent's range will still be wide enough for them to overfold versus a river bet. If we are using an overbet on the turn, our opponents don't really have to defend all that often. Maybe they only have to call some of their bluff catchers. In this case, this would be the top pairs. But if we bet small, even though our opponents are overfolding a lot of these combos, they still will definitely call with a lot of top pairs, and people don't like bluff catching on the river. So we are forcing our opponent to put in some money with their bluff catchers, and then when we go for that big river bet, our opponents will just not call those hands. We are squeezing more EV out of them by keeping their overall defending range very wide on the turn, and then bluffing on the river. I think it's a really good idea to have a sense of how the solver plays on the river, however, because strategies can be very different depending on the specific runout. One of the most common mistakes that people make in poker is to just have a very weak and exposed checking range, and we just want to avoid falling into that trap of checking too many of our weak hands. You can see that after betting small on the flop and on the turn, the solver will keep betting a lot of weak hands, which is pretty unintuitive for most people. We can also deviate from the strategy we're looking at exploitatively. In particular, I do like the idea of betting very big with our strongest hands. So let's just look at a few different boards, starting with this one, to really understand how the solver plays on the river. I think the logical place to start is actually on the turn. So on the turn, we understand that the solver is using a smaller bet size because there are many weaker hands in small blinds range that really just want to bet small, right? So trips and straights and top pairs are quite abundant, and they sort of overpower the natural incentive to overbet on the turn. Going into the river, we just want to keep in mind that this is the bulk of our range. And just like on the turn, all of these different hands will have different amounts of equity on the river, which will then shape the strategy. So let's assume we bet small and our opponent calls and the river is the four of spades. We already saw the strategy, but just to clarify it, the solver is using a small bet size very often, and it is using some medium bets and really not that many overbets here. I think a really good way of dissecting this strategy is to figure out which hand classes are strong enough to value bet for each size. Starting with the overbets, our strongest flushes prefer to use that bet size. Full houses are strong enough, and I suppose quads are strong enough, but they bet small to balance out that range. The medium bet size is preferred by most of our flushes and then some of our straights. And then that very, very small bet size is used quite often with our trips, also some of our top pairs. This is going to be basically the default strategy on the river after betting small on the turn. Most of the hands that bet small on the turn are really interested in keeping the pot as small as possible on the river. So they will again use the smallest size possible. Certain cards can definitely change up the dynamic, however. If we switch out this Four of Spades to the Ace of Hearts, then obviously the strategy shifts quite a lot. The majority of our range are going to be full houses here. This is 40% of our overall range, but we still don't have that many strong full houses in our range. The majority of the full houses are going to be quite weak because our turn range had many more trips in it than it had top pairs. So I think it's very important to just think about things very conceptually when you get to the river, and by understanding where the bulk of your range is, you can make sense of this river strategy far easier. Exploitatively, I don't think there's anything wrong with just using an overbet size on pretty much any river, in addition to whatever strategy you want to go with. The reason for this is because people do not raise often enough versus small bets. Small bets are going to be very, very common on the river, and so you're kind of missing out on value by betting small on the flop with a strong hand, betting small on the turn, and then also betting small on the river. The solver obviously likes to protect the smaller bet size by betting these stronger hands for that size, but practically, I would much rather just overbet and not really worry about protecting that range. If you take a look at how your opponents should respond versus that small bet, they have to raise very, very often here. In fact, they're raising around 27% of the time, and they have to bluff raise incredibly often with hands like pocket nines, pocket eights, pocket sevens, and a lot of rivers are going to have unintuitive raises like these. If the opponent is not raising 40% of the time with pocket sixes, it's definitely more than fine to not worry about protecting the weaker bets and instead just overbet with your strongest hands to at least get some money in the pot. Let's take a look at one more river. This was our low flop and our overcard turn, and we're gonna bet small here, big blind's gonna call, and the river is the 7 of clubs. My question to you, what bet sizes do you think the solver is going to use on the river? If you like, feel free to pause the video. If not, we're just going to dive right into it. Just like before, we want to start by thinking about our turn range composition for that small bet. We saw in the YouTube video that this bet was used by a lot of our weaker top pairs, many under pairs, and many former top pairs that are now second pairs. If we just hover over this one, you will see that the majority of the range is really concentrated around that weaker top pair and second pair region. And if you think about it, this specific river is actually going to upgrade a lot of those hands. The second pairs that we bet are now going to be trips. And trips are going to be pretty powerful here because we do keep our opponent's range wide by only betting small on the flop and on the turn. Still, we will have a lot of our weaker top pairs that are not really interested in betting big. So although the solver will use the overbet size a bit more often here, when we compare it to that previous example, we're still going to use a small bet size fairly often. I do think that predicting the river strategy this way just takes a lot of practice. On the flop and on the turn to some extent, we can just memorize a few heuristics to understand the solver strategy. But on the river, I do think that training yourself to think about hand classes this way is going to be a little bit better for your game. There are just so many different rivers, it's impossible to form specific heuristics, but even understanding what the river strategy looks like on a very, very broad level is going to get you very far. And of course, we want to play exploitatively on the river as well. Bluffing on the river works very well regardless of what the river is. The overall betting frequency is going to be roughly 50% on most rivers. Of course, it is going to fluctuate a lot on specific cards as we saw earlier. But if you just want to bluff maybe like 60 or 70% of the time, I think that's going to be fine versus pretty much everybody. Regardless of what size you're using, if it's a small size or if it's a big bet size, your opponents are always going to have to call with a lot of weak bluff catchers. If you overbet here, you can see in just a second that the opponents have to call with some ace highs, they have to call with some king highs even, and tons of weak low pairs and third pairs. Most people just don't like bluff catching, so even if they have a slightly stronger range coming into the river because they overfolded on the turn, they will still definitely overfold on the river. Of course, be mindful of the fact that it is a little bit easier to defend on the river than it is on the turn, especially if you're using a big overbet. So maybe if you're playing against someone who likes to bluff catch you a lot, maybe they think you're very aggressive, there is an argument to be made about giving up here, in which case maybe you might want to explore other bluffing options like bet check bet or check bet bet in order to really keep your opponent's range wide and to get into spots where their defending threshold is much weaker than what we're looking at here. The key really is to consider the specific range versus range interaction to understand what the strategy looks like, and then to bluff very aggressively versus most opponents, and maybe slow down versus one or two regs in your pool. The very last point that I want to talk about in this video is the very important turn exploit, and that exploit is to bet check raise your strongest hands. Bet check raise means that after you c-bet on the flop with a strong hand, you check with it in order to raise. This makes a lot of intuitive sense. If bet, bet, bet is a very good bluffing line, then obviously it's going to be very bad for your value hands. Mathematically, bet check raise just happens to be the best line for value betting. What really happens here is opponents will fold a lot versus any turn bet, but if you check, they will actually bet a little bit too often, which really incentivizes you to take this line. If we just go back to the turn strategy on King 10, 10, Ace, you will see something that is quite important. And that is the fact that all of our strongest hands on the turn are going to be indifferent between betting or checking. And this will be true for basically any turn. Right? So very clearly, if we're playing here and we're holding something like Ace 10, this hand is indifferent. The EV of checking very massively goes up because our opponents are betting too often after we check, and the EV of betting decreases because our opponents are going to overfold. If we do want to overbet on the turn though, we could do something like bet small and then bet overbet and then maybe go all in on the river. And usually that works out well for value betting as well, but this one is definitely a bit more tricky to implement compared to check raises. And it's not even clear that this line is better versus check raising. I think mathematically check raising works out to be a better option anyways. Just to demonstrate the fact that our strongest hands will always be indifferent on the turn, I'm going to randomize it a few times. This is Queen 5-3-3. And if we highlight our very strongest hands, which will be our trips and better, then you will see every single combo is going to be indifferent between betting or checking. I suppose with the small exception of pocket threes. Randomizing it one last time to make it fully clear. Let's do something entirely different this time. And again, every two pair set and straight is going to be indifferent between betting or checking. The stupid, pesky exception of pocket fours. But yeah, this line really is a bit of a life hack if you haven't encountered it before. All of these strong hands are more than fine to raise with on the turn. If your opponent bets, they'll usually overuse this medium bet size, and it really just works out mathematically. Bluff selection is interesting, I think, on the turn. When you are facing a medium turn bet, a lot of your weaker pairs are going to get devalued, so bluffs will actually come from hands like Queen Jack or something like Queen 9. This is a bit more rare with top pairs though. More often you'll see your second pairs, especially if they have a draw, as bluffing candidates. This hand is only bluffing a little bit of the time, and the solver will also use a lot of combo draws. Hands like 9-7, 9-6, and all these other ones are actually raising quite often here. So it's pretty easy to find bluffing combos on the turn if you know what you're looking for, but honestly, if you just want to raise with your strongest hands and only bluff every now and then with something like Ace-9 or 9-7 of hearts, then that's more than fine. Definitely think about check raising on the turn as a pretty big part of your strategy and increase the check raising frequency with your strongest hands. And with that said, that is all that I have for today's video. I hope you guys really enjoyed this one, as well as that full coaching class on my YouTube. If you did, don't forget to subscribe and comment down below what you would like to see next. This has been Chai. I will see you in the next one.